Perfect. So yeah, thanks everyone for taking the time today. I know there's still so many Zooms in the world, and so it can be quite a drag, but I think it will be really interesting, and we'll do our best to make it very interesting. Please do feel free to ask any and all questions. Use the Q&A. This is going to be recorded. We will post this to our YouTube channel, and so this can be shared with your colleagues and others afterwards. And yeah, I think that's mostly it for the housekeeping. And so yeah, thanks so much. And so today is our second Scite masterclass, and this one I'm really truly excited about. Joel and I, have corresponded. I first, heard Joel speak about Scite actually on a podcast interview, and I said, oh, this person must be really smart. They know what they're doing. And I followed his work, kind of from the side for a while now. And I think it's really interesting because it's not that he's just looking at one discipline, but it's very interdisciplinary. And, I think that highlights a lot of the strength of what Scite provides is, you can't be an expert in every single discipline. And so how do you utilize kind of expert analyses and data in this way? And so I'm really fascinated to kind of listen to his talk. And I know I'm supposed to go a bit slower because I often talk too fast, but I'm going to maybe go a little faster just so we can get to what I think is the most interesting part of the webinar. And so once again, thanks everyone for joining. Also, if you're uncomfortable asking a question on Zoom, feel free to email me directly. My email's there, and our Twitter account is @Scite. You can also tweet at us as well. You can also live tweet this if you really want. And so what is Scite? Why did we build Scite? To tell that story, I kind of, want to walk you through kind of my journey, which, started with a PhD about 7 years ago. And so this is what I spent most of my time doing, 7 years, and the 5 years prior to that at Virginia Tech was looking at cancer cells and non-cancer cells, human cells divide. And so we would take a lot of beautiful images and make these movies after, making them glow pretty colors, green and, red and things like this. And I often walk around New York City sometimes thinking I have very weird skills that I'll probably never use again, which is like immunostaining. And so this is, what occupied most of my day job, if you will, was thinking about, what are the effects of aneuploidy on chromosome segregation? And so this was, we put an extra chromosome into that cell, and we compared that to other cells that didn't have an extra chromosome. And we really looked to see were there more mistakes. And so you can see a lagging chromosome and then, the resultant aneuploidy here. In addition to this, I was also interested in, how science is done besides, what your work is at the bench, right? So how is it funded? How is it published? How is peer review work? Because I think these things are, equally as important as kind of that image or video that I just showed you. And so I was, doing studies, on the side, kind of back of the napkin type studies. So nothing, too in depth around bibliometrics, but really starting to think about these things and reading books, looking at, the history of peer review, of publishing, et cetera. And around this time, in 2012, this paper came out. And so this paper got a lot of attention. It was in Nature. It made some pretty shocking kind of discoveries or claims in that most, major cancer studies could not be reproduced. And so this got the attention of me. It got the attention of my co-founder, a lot of people in industry, even, made it into the New York Times, and I think continues to be discussed, not just by us, but by people today. And that is science reproducible in, cancer research and machine learning and psychology? Are these things that we're publishing and reading, can they stand the test of time? Can they be built upon, right? Or are we wasting a lot of opportunity cost, a lot of time, a lot of people's energies, and really a lot of people's lives, right? Because behind this cancer research is not just like, phase 1 was unsuccessful. There are actual people in there. And I think that's, important to remember. And so that study, which is highlighted by this one pie chart here, was, building off of a previous study that wasn't a comment in Nature, so didn't receive as much attention, but found similar, findings in that, looking at a lot of different indications or diseases and trying to validate the findings from major studies in the literature, more often than not couldn't, right? And so this is a worrisome problem. And really, I think there's actually a fascinating law called Eroom's law, which is Moore's law, but spelled backwards. And what we're starting to see in drug development is the more money we're putting in, the less, drug approvals we're getting. And I think there's a complex reasons, multifaceted reasons for that. So it's not just Scite is going to fix all of this. But I think, looking at how we do research and kind of the enterprise of research, or the science of science, if you will, is important. And Joel is actually calling in from the National Academy of Science because he is attending a Science of Science talk or multiple talks, something that I'm pretty jealous of myself. And so, I did what a lot of researchers do at that time. I wrote a paper, right? I was like, oh, this looks to be a problem. Let me discuss, what we can do to fix that. And the idea was initially to introduce this reproducibility metric that we called the R factor. We almost called it the V factor because we were really hesitant to only be like kind of reproducing the exact set of experiments. And in that paper, it basically borrowed from my experience as a researcher in that, I knew studies within my field that were highly cited, that came from MIT, that were in the world's best journal like Cell, but, were shown to be, not strong enough. So 3 or 4 other labs tried to reproduce it and couldn't. Others wouldn't know that because it was buried amongst an avalanche of 300 plus citations. And so we wanted to kind of incentivize and identify reliable or reproducible studies, not just, highly cited or flashy studies. And so we thought introducing a metric around that would be the best solution. And it's pretty funny to look back on this R factor, because in this paper, we discuss other people doing this. We even name Elsevier, Thomson Reuters used to own Web of Science, who said, and NCBI, who said, these are the groups that should do this. So we didn't even think it was possible for us to really do it at this stage. But, writing a paper and suggesting Elsevier or Thomson Reuters should do something is really not the way to kind of get things done. And so we started to work on this from the side, and slowly this has emerged into what Scite is. And so really, I'd say our goal has also broadened a bit. It's not just that we've built this reproducibility metric. We want to make research more reliable. Everyone talks about accelerating research, and I think that's great. But I think really we need to make sure that the shoulders giants that we're standing upon, or the shoulders of giants that we're standing upon are strong, right? Like if we're building on the shoulders of giants, are they real, right? Are they solid footing? So we built Scite to make research more reliable, to make it more understandable. And so it's not just about reproducibility any longer. A lot of people use Scite to understand, how has this article been cited? How has this topic been discussed? And it's almost like expert summaries. There's no AI kind of in the expert summary. It is from an expert, a PhD or someone that's published, has written about this paper. And you can get that from the citation context. And really, I think this has evolved in kind of our core aim, which is we really want to bring forward the next generation of citations. And I think citations are, they get a bad rap by academics. They're used to assess us. When we said we're introducing this R factor, there's a lot of pushback. They're counted, we use them pretty superficially, and I would say not so intelligently. And I think they get a bad rap, but they're amazing, right? They connect ideas across different disciplines, across time, across space. They're persistent, really forever, so long as there's libraries existing. And I think we could do so much more with them. And so that's what we're trying to do with Scite. And so the way that I like to show Scite is to show the world as it exists without Scite, and then to show it through the lens of Scite. And so this is, where those images and movies went into this paper, and you can still see some of them. This was the main, paper coming out of my PhD. We published in eLife. As I mentioned, I did my PhD at Virginia Tech. We collaborated with the hospital in Portugal, as well as the lab at the NIH, maybe not so far where Joel is sitting from now. It's been cited 62 times and then viewed about 11,000 times. And so this is what we all kind of look at when we see a paper. Where is it published? Who are the authors? What are affiliations? And then some metrics. And it's really hard not to. We'll probably make some snap judgments, right? Is this in a journal that I trust? Have I tried submitting there? Have I been rejected from there? Similar types of things with the affiliations. Oh, is it from a university that maybe I tried to work at or applied to? I also didn't get into Harvard, all these things. And that's even before we read the paper. Maybe that helps us determine if we want to read the paper. And I would say, we're not trying to fix all of that, but really we're focused on this number, so the citation number. And I would say that in most cases, we kind of glance at that, right? High is good, low is bad. And generally, we're not going to click it, right? Because if you do click it, you're going to come to a traditional citation index, which is going to show the list of cited documents. But, arguably, it's a lot of work to go through these documents, right? 63 documents, maybe you're going to scan those titles and find some relevant ones that way. And maybe you'll open 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, or maybe, even half a dozen, right? But to open 63 documents and see how they've interpreted the study that you're interested in, what they've said about it, if there's criticisms, supporting evidence, competing evidence, is a massive amount of work, right? It just takes hours to do that for 63 citations, let alone if you're looking at a paper that has hundreds or thousands. And so we want to make that information more digestible so that it can better inform and contextualize the research that you're looking at. So not just, looking at a superficial number and making a snap judgment, really utilizing that information to enrich your own understanding and your own research. And so we've done that, and this is a look at that same report through the lens of Scite by taking the citation context from the full text of the paper, right? So not just listing the citing articles, but showing the context from the article itself, so you can directly see this conversation happening amongst papers, right? And so this paper that was published in Molecular Biology Cell 3 years after mine by authors that are unshared by us, so no co-authors, says, in agreement with previous work, cites Nicholson et al. In 2015, the trisomic clone showed similar aberrations, albeit to a lesser extent, supplemental figure S to B. And so presumably no one on this call has read this study, but you're all now, with me in a matter of a single click and kind of a minute or two, able to see that there's another study that supports, a big central claim to this. And they say, a little bit to a lesser extent, right? And I think that's very powerful and otherwise is lost in today's world, right? So it's not just about finding, negative or contrasting studies. It's really, looking at how a research paper has been cited. We, get a lot of attention for our deep learning model that will look at these citation statements and classify, do they provide supporting or contrasting evidence? But I think equally as important is looking at where these citations come from. And there's no fancy deep learning or there is machine learning here because we have to extract this from PDFs, but there's no, classification model here. But, looking at a citation that appears in the introduction section versus the results or the discussion section can be very different. Similarly, one paper can cite another paper one time in passing the introduction, or it can cite it 10 times throughout the paper, right? And so we even allow you to filter, which I can't do because it's just a screenshot, by most engaged, right? And so really there's a lot of different reasons to cite an article, and there's a lot of different ways to cite an article. It's not just article to article, go figure that out, right? And so we're trying to open up that conversation so that you can better understand this at the paper level, at the researcher level, at the journal level, at the funder level, even at the topic level, right? And there's various ways of filtering upon that. And so, this data has opened up new use cases, I would say, beyond traditional citation indices and beyond just bibliometrics or scientometrics, which I think is really useful, again, not even for looking at papers, but really looking at topics. And so this is, keeping the story personal again, a personal use case of mine. From back in September 29 of 2021, which somehow feels very recent, but also like a lifetime ago. And so this is a tweet by Eric Topol. He has 600,000 plus followers on Twitter, sharing a finding from a preprint posted on medRxiv. And he says the title tells the story, right? No significant difference in viral load between vaccinated and unvaccinated, asymptomatic and symptomatic groups infected with SARS Delta variant. So that was pretty shocking to me. And I think, pretty concerning because there's hesitation around getting vaccination. And here's this study coming out saying, there's no difference between the viral load between these, right? So is vaccination keeping the viral load down? Is it not? How is this working? And so I opened this preprint, did kind of what I just did with my own paper, looked at, okay, the authors look legitimate. It looks like a research paper. It had really one figure and about 9 references. So that felt like it was rushed and, kind of put together quickly. Clearly, it had not been cited at this point because it was brand new, right? And so can Scite help with that, right? Or what can it do, or what can our data do to kind of help look at claims or topics or ideas or reagents or anything really? And so through our browser extension, it's not just providing this badge to show, the citation types. What you can do is highlight a claim, a term, anything, anywhere on the web, and then search that against our database of over 1 billion citation statements at this point. So, here's the claim, difference in viral load between vaccinated and unvaccinated. You can, expand that or make it smaller depending upon, what you think might return the most relevant results. And if you do that, you're then not searching just papers, you're searching these citation contexts directly itself. And what I found was that, there was a difference between vaccinated healthcare workers and unvaccinated healthcare workers if you're using a different test, right? So swabs. And so this was another preprint, actually, also in medRxiv. They were not citing each other. I think they probably should have been. And there's competing claims there. And as you can see, there's a supporting citation. And so it allowed me to not just discover one, kind of competing work, but another one as well. And I think that's pretty powerful for kind of, understanding what is the literature saying about X. And X can be, related to COVID. It can be related to, the incidence of dog flatulence. It can be, how does Peppa Pig influence my children? And I think that gets to the power of research, is that it's not just cancer research, right? It touches almost everything we do and informs that. And if we can utilize it better, it can, help us make sure we are, developing drugs, developing policies, living, based on reliable research, right? Power posing during talk, has been challenged in the literature. Maybe we should still be doing that. Maybe we shouldn't. And, so these things, it's not just about kind of research at the bench. And I think that's exciting. And so, this is also comes to place. A lot of this stuff gets amplified very quickly. We look at altmetric attention scores, and then later times, sometimes it's challenged, right? And I think it's very hard to find those challenging citations once it's kind of left the gate, right? And so we want to surface that and help people, make sure that, okay, maybe what we read and what we thought to be true, is not really, right? And so, we're tracking challenges to the literature as well. And so how do we do this? And I promised I was going to go quick, and I feel like I'm going slow now. How do we do this? So I mentioned we need access to the full text literature, which is true. And once we have the full text, though, it comes in XML, which is structured, albeit not all the same structure, even though there's supposed to be this, perfect format. But most of it still comes in PDF, right? Especially pre-2000. And so publishers, have a lot of PDFs. These PDFs come in a lot of different shapes and sizes, right? There can be 2-column, single column. The references and citations can have different formats. You can have superscript, subscript, parentheticals, brackets, author names, no author names. We have to match this. So identify the citation call out, take that information, and then reliably match it to the reference in the reference section. Take that string of information, which again will have varying degrees of information. Maybe it'll have the DOI in it, maybe it won't, maybe it'll have 2 authors and then an et al, maybe it'll have abbreviated journal. We have to take that string of information and then reliably match that to the version of record, the metadata. And so there's a lot of machine learning that goes into extracting out and building the citation graph from these PDFs, right? And so grabbing out the citation context. And so we use 11 different machine learning models. This has really been kind of a labor of love by this amazing researcher, Patrice Lopez, who's developed and worked on, this open source tool that we contribute back to extract this information from PDFs. And so that is, a core engine is processing these PDFs through Grobit and some sophisticated tweaks we've made. And then once we have that text around that citation callout, we then have a deep learning model that has been trained on roughly 50,000 annotated citation statements to try to indicate, is this author presenting supporting or contrasting evidence, or is it just mentioning it? And again, that relates a bit to like us looking at reproducibility. You can build other models looking at other things, and maybe we'll look at that someday. But right now we're trying to keep it as simple as possible. And so that training, how we did that roughly was we as members of the team with PhDs or MDs read roughly 50,000 different citation statements, looked at it based on this criteria and said, okay, they're citing this because they have supporting evidence, or they're citing this because they have competing evidence. And then that's gone in to feed the deep learning model. And that's important to do because we're not talking about small numbers, right? So we're now, over 1 billion citation statements that have been extracted from over 30 million, full text articles. Most of these are not open access at this point, thanks to a growing, number of partners with publishers. We have citation information on over 50 million journal articles, and that citation context. We've also, supplemented our smart citations with traditional references or traditional citations. So even when we don't have a full text, we still generally have a citation record, which I think is very important for having this comprehensive, record. And our aim is to have citation context for every article, to move beyond just this link, showing a link exists, to how that link has been made. As I mentioned, we partnered with many publishers at this point. I don't know if this is actually the correct order, but you can see kind of the trajectory of this. And generally, that's not always the easiest thing to do. But we have amazing partners with publishers. They've given us the content, we've text mined it, and made that discoverable in our system. And I think the benefit to the publishers is that they get a lot more visibility for articles that otherwise might not be there, and they can provide a better reading experience for researchers. And so we're now not just trying to be this startup doing something cool on the side. We're really trying to bring this to the ecosystem. And so we've partnered with preprint servers, publishers, to display that information directly on the version of record. So here's what it looks like on archive. And you can see it, you can toggle it on or off with their smart citations. Here's what it looks on Wiley. We're live on hundreds of journals there. This is maybe too big in some people's opinions. It certainly gets a lot of attention. It's also missing the paper citation, but it's still kind of this early days and early ways of looking at us. You can though see, like, they're displaying 364. We have a lot more here, right? So it's opening up a lot more of a conversation as well. It's also displayed on the Royal Society. They've kept traditional citations, but they've also displayed this in, ours alongside that. Journal of Applied Physiology. And then more recently, and this is a video, which I think is cool, again, because Joel is there, at the National Academy of Science, right? So we're now live on PNAS, and we display these citation statements. And this follows from the editor-in-chief, writing an editorial on zombie sites, right? Citing retracted papers and things like this. And so, this quote was really nice because, again, we're quite a small team, and, to get kind of an endorsement like this is pretty compelling. And she says, it's been abundantly clear for decades that just counting citations is an incomplete and often misleading way to characterize the contribution of a paper. And so we're happy to be working, with leading groups at this stage, and there's some more in coming to really, bring in these rich, smart citations to the ecosystem. And so, here's how researchers have kind of discussed this since the early days, and I'm not going to take too much time on this because we can see how Joel can discuss it. And I would be remiss to say, we're not the first ones to think about this, right? We thought we were so smart. We wrote this paper. There's an R factor, but the idea has been discussed for a long time now. And so here is Eugene Garfield talking about citation indexing and can it be automated in 1964. Eugene Garfield created the Web of Science, the world's first, science citation index, which influenced Google, influenced a lot of different things. And he very presciently discusses citation markers. And he says these markers would appear in the published citation index along with the usual citation data. And he gives an example, critique, or my personal favorite, calamity for mankind citation. And he says the intelligent machine would examine a new document and generate a critical statement such as rather poor paper. And so he had this idea also because lawyers have a citator system that is very similar to this, that has existed for even longer than 1964. And that allows lawyers to look at law and say, is this still good law? Is this, no longer good law? Has it been challenged? And so, this idea of Shepardizing, which is named after the creator, Frank Shepard, has been discussed of bringing it to sciences and research for a long time. It's just, an order of magnitude larger in terms of the amount of documents, and it's not as well structured because researchers can cite things kind of with whatever language they want before the call out, whereas lawyers have to use certain key terms doing that. And so this is, effectively kind of bringing that vision to life. And it's something that I think is pretty cool, although we have, still a lot more work to do. And so most of this work is funded through grants. And so I'd like to acknowledge them, the NIH as well as the NSF. And again, say thanks to everyone for joining. We will take questions at the end of this, but you can also email me with feedback, not just questions, but like, hey, it'd be cool if you did this, or hey, this sucks, and we will really listen, and make improvements upon that. And so thank you very much for your time. And again, I'm very happy to introduce the next speaker, Professor Joel Chan. Joel is going to walk through, his use case of Scite, but also, his research in general. And so it's not just, this open endorsement. Really, I think it'll be an interesting talk. And so I'll stop sharing here and be quiet. And thank you so much for this.
This is awesome. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And visible? Cool. It's really cool to hear the roots of Scite, Josh. I'm so glad you didn't stop at writing a paper, but actually brought it to life. And I'll say at the high level, one of the interesting contrasts between how you started it and how I'm using it is that I'm not just using it to focus on credibility and veracity, but it's actually for creativity. And I'll get into that a little bit, like to sort of use the citations to identify interesting opportunities. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the context. Why did I find Scite interesting? And actually, I actually forgot I mentioned it in the podcast. I think I'll like drop it in the chat or in the YouTube comments or something, where the larger context is really about how do you get a big picture synthesis of a problem area, not a field, but a problem area where you want to advance. And one of the things that you need to do is to collect stuff, right? What's out there? You may think that, the first thing to do is to search for things, but it turns out that's not very effective in the kinds of places that I work in. And I suspect many of you are in similar boats. So my research is extremely interdisciplinary. So my general area is creativity support systems, which is ridiculously broad. We have studies in neuroscience, we have studies in computer science, we have studies in management, organization. Creativity is just kind of like weird phenomena that cuts across all these different classes of categories and fields and disciplines. And so you may think of some of the challenges there. I'll kind of point out here. There's this idea of scatter. So I talked to Josh earlier about how, and I just mentioned this, like the stuff that I need to read is scattered everywhere across these different fields, across these different disciplines and journals and so on. And they use different language, use different words. And so that makes it very hard to cover the space and sort of use very targeted search. And also, yeah, so the keywords vary a lot. And so they tend to be high scatter to use multiple paradigms. And so what the literature shows in terms of the studies of library information science and what strategies people use to navigate these domains accords with probably your personal experience, which is that in these areas, you really need to supplement or even just rely more on network-based foraging is what I call it, right? So you kind of navigate through network, citations, and co-authors and so on. And Josh, you mentioned shepherdizing. So there's this like really cool example. There's a link I'll drop in the chat also of a particular biotech company that was started up based on zeroing on a promising molecule using shepherdizing. This person had a legal background, it turns out, and they did the manual way. It was very painful. So that's why Scite is really interesting to me, is because it helps me to kind of navigate the literature that way. And just to quickly show you where it sits in my larger workflow. So on the left part here is this idea of like finding stuff, right? Getting stuff. And you can see lectures, reports, Twitter, people, and there's this sort of like navigating the literature here. And this is where I really rely heavily on a few different tools. And one of the most important ones is Scite. And I'll talk about the specific use case of Scite. It's more on the sort of foraging end of things, as a network-based foraging end of things. So just to give you a sense of like, where does it fit in the whole, as Josh said, like it doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves some problems really, really well that I have not found elsewhere. Okay. So yeah, so as it sits in a larger context, I don't rely only on chaining and shepherdizing, right? In situations where I want to have the highest confidence of coverage, I will use structured keyword searches in databases, but that requires a high degree of understanding of the language being used as well as places to search. So I often start with Scite and citation searches to get my feet on the ground. Okay, so as Josh said, the big challenge is citations have a very low signal to noise ratio. I wrote this independently of him. This is the problems that I've been facing. It's really annoying to get to a paper and you don't have context of how it's cited, and there's a ton of citations. There's no way to navigate it. And yeah, the UX of Google Scholar doesn't really help. It doesn't expose why a paper was cited. So I find Scite very useful in a nutshell to help me cut through the noise to find the signal and citation trails, specifically to kind of get at lines of evidence. Is one very kind of interesting way I use it. So I'm going to talk through some examples. I'm going to show you some examples of how this happens in my work. And the reason why I'm showing this here is this is my notebook. So I think, Josh, we had this interaction of like, I want Markdown export, plain text export from Scite because I make sense of things and track my progress for searching in my notebook. So that's why I'm showing you this. So I'm going to open this in sidebar here. And walk through some examples. So one very common use case is I find an interesting paper and I immediately try to find other papers to contextualize and test the idea, particularly if it's interesting, because interesting sometimes means, like in Josh's example of counterintuitive, right? No difference between vaccinated and unvaccinated. You want to put it in context, right? To understand, is there a gap here? Is this something I should trust? So I have numerous examples of this. So I'll just show you like how it goes in my notebook, right? So right here, I'm following this thread on how can we set up note-taking systems to help you be a better creative expert. And the literature here is super fragmented. So I'm taking all these notes and so on, and then I have this core seed paper, right? The kind of classic paper on cognitive flexibility theory. You can see here I note my reflections on following the citation trails. Like it looks like there's gaps in the citation. So I'll get to that later in terms of like how this supports creativity. But just to show you the example, right? So from this one, I often save these trails because I can't always, I'm juggling multiple things at a time. So I kind of leave these trails for myself to come back to. So I save these trails. So this is the Scite report that is for the classic paper. And whenever I go in here, the first thing I do is I do that. I cut out the mentionings just to see like, you know, what is there a signal in terms of support and contrast. Turns out this one has a pretty good trail for me to follow in terms of, oh, there looks like there's 8 supporting papers. It's really useful to also have, there's this like self-cite flag as well in here that is not present, right? So that immediately gives you information as well of like, other people are finding similar things to this theory or supporting this thing that are not them, you know, because a surprising amount of citations are from self-citations. So what I do is then for me, the supporting and contrasting papers are important ones to follow up on. I add them to my stack because that helps me understand the phenomenon, right? So I put that in here, and each of these looking things are papers that I've saved. So in an ideal world, I would sort of be able to one-click, you know, import all these into Zotero, but it's really not that bad because I don't necessarily want to import all of them right away. So here we have this wonderful click to copy. So I do that, and it's really wonderful to have. Actually, I screenshotted this. This was before the Markdown thing was live. But that's why, because the citation context is so useful. for me to remember, why did I grab this paper? It's in the line of this, this seed paper, and it cites this paper in this particular way. That helps me remember when I go back to this trail, what am I looking for when I read this paper? I'm looking for, looks like there's positive results in online learning, and there's abstract here, and then here's the kind of context. So that's one example. And I think this is really useful because if you go to Google Scholar, for example, whoops, if you go to Google Scholar for this paper, this is to Josh's point of like, this has 1,921 citations. I don't know how I would filter through this, honestly. We'll probably resort to, you can search in the citation on Google Scholar, but you probably search for like authors and keywords, kind of shooting in the dark. So this like really quickly helps me to cut through, find the lines of evidence. It's not, again, like it's not perfect, but we can actually improve things too. If I see something that I disagree with and say, this doesn't actually support, I can flag it. Well, I used to.
We just redesigned this now.
Oh, you redesigned it. Where is it now?
It's the ellipses on the right. Yeah.
The ellipses. There we go. Yeah. So I've done this several times for my own papers.
I still look below too. Yeah.
Yeah. I found miscites on my own paper and like site classification, or when I'm actually doing this kind of search. So yeah. So that's one example. Just a couple other examples. This one. What's this one? This is. Oh yeah. So this is like a classic paper, and this kind of speaks to the contrast between how we read papers in grad school and how I think we should, is to really have this context. This is like a classic paper. People cite it all the time. And, you know, I wanted to sort of systematically cover, because I'm writing a systematic review of this topic. So this is a paper about how people you know, have trouble coming up with new ideas that aren't influenced by things they've seen in the past. It's like a classic thing that people claim is true in psychology. And it turns out, yeah, there's 903 citations, but we do be able to cut quickly into, if we want to really understand that line of evidence, we can cut right through to the 18 supporting sites from 14 papers. So here I linked it here per, so I linked it here. I didn't add it yet because I'll come back to it later. But yeah, just like before, you can see, I think in the past, when there's a few unclassifieds, I also leave those checked so I can look at them to see what they are. Because mentioning to me is just like noise to clean out in the early stages. So this one filters directly for support. I also usually add contrasting. I didn't realize, Josh, that we can do this thing. This is essentially the same now as in a Semantic Scholar's influential sites. So this is a one-stop shop for me now.
Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of a long time coming. You can do it on references too, which this one we don't have references for, but it's also interesting for new studies. You can see like which ones have it built on top, right? So for my paper on the references, I cite one paper 10 times, which is a core, you know, like we use the cell lines from it and, you know, heavily discuss it. And so
that is actually incredibly useful.
And again, like, it's not like any fancy machine learning. It's just counting the number of, you know, that one's 5 times.
This is amazing. This is amazing. How new is this feature?
It's pretty new. I mean, this gets to like, we need more marketing people kind of, we make a lot of changes. I mean, we just released like changes to design, changes to search.
This is incredible. I'm going to use this right away. Because one of the things that I use Scite for is like forward chaining, right? And backward chaining. This is really useful to like be able to see what influenced this one. So connected papers is another tool I use to get a feel for the neighborhood, but it's a little bit less explainable because they kind of use co-citations and co-authorship to build up the graph. So the edges are not, the meaning of the edges is not transparent to me, but this is really clear to me. Like if I cited this exact paper, 10 times, then this is an important thing for this line. So this is actually really cool. I'm going to use it right away. So let me just check the time here. Okay, so I'll show one more example, and then I'll go to another interesting examples. Here's another one. This is, I think, a good example because this is a controversial but very interesting hypothesis that the sciences can be ordered in terms of their legibility. And so people call it a hierarchy of the sciences or whatever. Very controversial. People don't like to talk about it. But it turns out there's actually some interesting empirical evidence that starts in the 80s. And so this is pretty important for an interesting research question I'm exploring about how the dynamics of novelty vary across the fields. And one hypothesis is that it's hard to, you can see this is like very far from my home field is cognitive science and HCI. We see some connections in psychology here, but a lot of it is in sort of information science. So I need to sort of, they use different terms too. But here, we've got these like Scite reports that help me contextualize. So this one in particular is like a, let's see, oops. This one in particular is, I read this paper and so I filtered, there's 6 supporting citations. So these again, like trails for me to sort of come back to. And part of the reason this is useful is it puts the brakes on my thinking a little bit. So it's like a little bit of a kind of positive pressure. It's kind of in my face the whole time of like, don't overfit on this paper. Like it's like always there. It's in here, it's in my notes, it's in when I look at stuff on Google Scholar, as you can see, the citation, the extension is active here. So it's constantly in my face. It really helps me sort of balance my creativity with rigor. So I really like the extensions, putting it everywhere. So I'll skip the last 2 examples. Let's see. Yeah, so this is I guess the original use case, Josh, of like trying to find replications. When I'm trying to be systematic, I kind of showed that. So this is again a classic study in my field, and just verifying because I was referring to a hypothesis and I really need to build on this idea. And I wanted to make sure we cite this paper all the time, but I actually don't have like a library of like the line of evidence. So I went back to this and pulled out the Scite thread. And I was like, okay, cool. Yeah, this has been replicated many times. So let's go ahead and come up with a study design. And I can come back to this anytime to verify. So let's see. Yeah, the second set of interesting examples is this, again, getting to the creativity side, helping to identify gaps, right? Few people seem to be explicitly following up on this to really test whether it holds up. And that's often an interesting low-hanging fruit for a study idea. So I just showed this one for the Spiro one. The trail kind of ends in the early 2000s and doesn't extend to my field. And so that to me is a signal. There's an interesting gap here of, are the findings still holding up with the new technology that we have now? Why aren't we citing this? Let's dig into this more. It's an interesting signal that will be hard for me to see with trawling through 20,000 citations or 2,000 citations. I quickly run through the line of evidence and see the line of evidence kind of stops. What happened? This is a really important paper. Why are not people trying to follow up on extending this or opposing this or supporting this? That's a really interesting signal for me. Oh yeah, here we go. This is another good one. So let's see. What was this paper? Oh, right, this is the one I just saw, right? So this is the Cole hierarchy of the sciences one. This was done in the 80s. It has 600 citations on Google Scholar, but only 2 meaningful ones on Scite, both supportive, but not really granular and not really true to the claims of Cole. This is something that probably, I don't know how I would do it with 600 citations, but this like zero in on the 2 and I see mildly supportive, right? Because like, again, like Scite is very clear about its confidence level and it shows you the context. It doesn't say it's strongly supporting, weakly supporting. It lets us make the judgment. I can just see the valence. I can just judge for myself. There's a gap here. It's not robust as much as I like it to be. It's really interesting hypothesis, but 600 citations. People are like building on this in various ways, but is it really true? How robust is this? In fact, we don't really know. This is a really interesting sort of gap.
It's interesting the dates on those, 88 and 2021 too.
Right? Yeah. So these are really interesting. That it's these patterns start to jump out a bit more when you're not looking at hundreds of citations, because they're kind of overwhelmed trying to sit through. You can sort of like find these like slicing and dicing. So really, really grateful for that. This one is like ratio of support and opposition. So this one is a what's this one? I think this is about like if you go for a walk, your ideas get better. So a lot of my attention is citation wise, but there's a Scite report that helps me to kind of see the contrasting cites. Here's the wonderful copy text. So that gives me a searchable text, contradicting cites, unlike previous work. Really useful. We get this kind of ratio. Actually, you can see in here also from a different view. In here, how's my audio, by the way? Okay. Can you still hear me? Yeah. I'm actually going to change my
headphones died. Yeah,
I think we can still hear you.
Yeah. So you see this thing here? So this is like a integration into Rome, but it has a Scite integration as well, because Scite's wonderful. It's like it wants to put this stuff everywhere. So here I can easily see the ratio as well, sort of 12:3. So that's really interesting.
I think that's also important because that will update, right? If you're looking at these analyses and pulling them out manually, like, again, there's one from 88 in 2021 and it will stay, up to date.
Yeah.
There's also, this is a new thing also you might not be aware of. So there's a badge that can show it by section as well, and that can be added as well. So like,
oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
So again, I should reach out to the person that did this.
Yeah. So you can see in Zotero, I also have the extension active. So I deliberately put it everywhere to kind of help me sort of think holistically and contextually anytime I'm encountering papers. So like Josh said, it surfaces different signals to sort of counteract my snap judgments. I don't just like look at the authors and the year and the journal, but I also have a sense of like, in my particular case, the level of engagement, meaningful engagement, or sort of follow-up work, because that's what's important to me as a researcher, finding these lines of things to follow up on. Okay. Yeah, those are, I think, 10 minutes for Q&A. So that gives you a flavor of how to use it. Find it really useful. I don't know how to use it. Do these things elsewhere. So thank you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. Amazing. This is also really amazing kind of demo of Rome, which I've seen from the side and I've always been very interested, but then I'm like overwhelmed and say, I'm used to my kind of very unnetworked, pen and paper.
It's network in your head.
Yeah, so thanks again for that. I found it really fascinating, and I hope everyone else did. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, either for Joel or myself. You can also put them in the chat because I feel like most people are doing that. And so I'll go to the first one that I saw, which relates to the coverage, right? So I'll read this out loud. It says, is Scite weighted towards certain fields? I find that many of the papers I'm working with in education have no Scite metrics at all, perhaps a function of the specific publishers. So this is partially true. Yes, Scite is better in fields where we have good coverage and good partnerships with publishers. I would say it's the best in biomedical literature because biomedical literature is quite large. There is a lot of open content, so PubMed Central exists. It's also just larger field. And so we do have, amazing coverage there, but our focus is really to look at all of research. And so we have, partnerships with leading social sciences publishers like American Psychological Association, Emerald, Cambridge University Press, large publishers like Wiley, which are interdisciplinary. And so we're continually working with more and more publishers. There's some big indexing agreements, in the works, which are related to physics, and one on chemistry coming quite soon. And this takes time, right? I showed you this graph going from 200 to a billion, over the course of time. Publishers are not just giving away their content for free, and so it takes a while to form these relationships and to build these partnerships. And our aim, yes, is to cover for all of this, because I think the context beyond just kind of the supporting and contrasting will help contextualize and kind of provide signals, as Joel puts it, that will help with your understanding and interpretation of studies. And so if there's fields that you think it doesn't have good coverage on, education, and there's specific publishers that might not be represented, please do email me and let me know, and I can make that a focus, or email them and let them know. I think that helps also a lot. And now we have more than 24 different publishers, so oftentimes they'll see that and can sign on pretty quickly. So thanks for that. There's a few questions asking about Rome, and I think that was answered by other people in the chat. So thanks so much. His notebook was looking at Rome, and again, I think it's a really fascinating way of kind of taking next generation citations into next generation note keeping. And so maybe PhD students in the future will be using Rome instead of just pen and paper, which I think where most of my notes are, or maybe both. The second question I see, sorry if this is already covered, I wonder how is the confidence of the score calculated? Also, I'm a bit surprised that there are often very few contrast statements. Is that the case, or just happen to see uncontroversial papers? So the way that we've developed this was, as I mentioned, to annotate, to build a training data set of roughly 50,000 manually annotated citation statements. So that is two different experts read these same citation statements, would score them, and then they would have to agree. And so there's this high rater agreement amongst the raters. And then there would be reconciliation. We have a 10,000 manually annotated citation holdout set that is supposed to be reflective of the literature. So that one, the training data we've optimized, and we've taken edge cases and added that to get it as strong as we can be. The holdout set, we never add to the model. It is literally a holdout. Also manually annotated, is supposed to be representative of the literature, of all of the literature. And it's been sampled as such. And so that the training data has been, we've tried all these different models, and we have a paper on this actually, which I can share in the link, that describes this, the different models from Elmo to Scite. They're all named after nice fun characters. Testing these things for precision and recall, and really, testing that against our holdout set. How good is this at recalling them, and how good is this at the precision of this? And so it's not perfect, as Joel showed. You can flag these things, but it's come quite a long ways, and is quite good at this stage. And so we have precision scores for contrasting is 0.85, meaning if you see 10 of them, 8 of them are going to be right, and for supporting 0.8. And so those are the bar, and we favor more for being right than showing a bunch of kind of false negatives, because I think that's important for the trust of the user. To your second kind of point, you're surprised that there are very few contrasts. I think that's not a reflection of the accuracy of the tool. It's more a reflection of the bias of the literature. And so, in some of these fields, they're quite small fields. There's not much incentive to call someone out publicly and to, do that in a paper. Oftentimes, maybe the person you're challenging is your reviewer, either on a paper or other papers or grants. And so I think, this, I think is a correct reflection. We've seen this in other papers as well, where there's not a lot of negative cites, what they've seen. And so I think, hopefully by surfacing contrasting cites and making it more easier to discover, maybe there's more of a reason to. It also takes a long time to publish things, especially if it's not a new finding per se, right? And so, there's many reasons for that, but I think, yeah, Joel already has a citation for it, which is amazing. But yeah, people, tend to cite positive things. One thing that I can say, which is kind of, my own anecdotal experience, is I found it to be very interesting when a researcher self-contrasts themselves, right? So contrasting is not just bad, where contrasting this is bad, I hate this article, and never use it. I now have seen self-cites that are contrasting and say, okay, I really trust this person, because now they're not just putting out a perfect polished trophy that they say nothing's ever changed in my thinking. They're, in public, evolving their thinking. And so was counterintuitive to me, but I think, this is something that I would love to publish the backstories on people like that. because I think they should be lauded. I think they should be rewarded. I think this is what we want, right? And so again, it's not just supporting is good, contrasting is bad, right? It's more complex and nuanced than that. And so we want to give that power to people to look at these things, and so they can own and judge themselves. And again, as Joel pointed out, contrasting or supporting can have various valences, right? There can be, we could not replicate this work at all, or we found a 15% difference, right? And again, that comes to your understanding as a human to say, okay, I really don't trust this, and it just has one contrasting, but maybe it has 20 supporting, but like this study seems a lot more strong. I think that comes there. And I think that's mostly it for questions. So if there's other questions, again, feel free to raise your hand and maybe we can unmute, or you can also ask them in the chat. And you can, feel free to ask Joel more questions on his workflow as well in the last few minutes.
I see some questions in here about like filtering out irrelevant sites, which I think is covered by, that's what I do all the time with Scite. That's one big reason I use it, is to filter out the meaningless mentioning sites. However, I think it's an interesting point as Scite grows, whether people start to game it by writing their citations in an informative way, which, how gameable is that? I guess you could what would be the countermeasure for that? Right now, I find it very useful to filter out the dimensions. So it depends on how those are done. Yeah.
Yeah, mention is just kind of the default. I mean, this is actually, I don't know if gaming is the right word. Like, we kind of hope that people will write more explicitly if they are supporting or contrasting something because of this.
Yeah.
And not just because it'll be easier for the tool, but because it'll be more clear, right? And I think, again, like academics maybe are sometimes intentionally ambiguous around that, because it's hard to plant your flag and say, this is what I think. It's easier to be like, it's kind of this, kind of that, and we've cited that and things like that.
Yeah.
So. Okay. Again, thanks so much, Joel. It was really fascinating for me to see this use case. We need to do a better job at sharing updates on things, I think, and we'll try to work on that. And thanks everyone for the questions and the time. We will post this on YouTube so you can share this, look at it more. There are tutorials and help guides on there. Again, there's also emails that are very easy to reach us. We do like feedback, right? So it's not just like, hey, this is great. Like, let us know what's not great, and so that we can work on that and improve that. And as you can see, some of that gets put into play where Joel requested an ability to kind of copy things in, and we made that happen. So thanks again for everyone, and thank you very much, Joel. Enjoy the rest of your day listening to more, I guess, similar to talks that we just gave.
Yeah.
Okay. Cheers, guys.
Yep.